And so one of the things that we thought we would do today, since we don't, to sort of vary things up a little bit, is have a couple of folks, including myself, talk to you about research or ideas we've been doing. Later on today, you'll hear from Scott Page, who does a lot of research on diversity. Adam Bryant, who's one of the co-hosts, will be talking about some of the ideas he's researched. And I thought I would talk about a little bit about teams and a book that I wrote, Smarter, Faster, Better, which actually comes out in paperback just by chance today. It came out, not that I'm encouraging you to buy a copy, but if you do, it's at Amazon. It's a great deal. Everyone, your family will love it. Yeah, and the first slide, and you'll notice what my first slide is before I actually start talking. And the reason why I thought this was particularly germane for the conversation we've been having today is because, for me, I started working on this book about 4 years ago, when I had written a book called The Power of Habit that came out. And Power of Habit came out, and I wasn't certain anyone would buy it, and then it ended up doing really well. And it was the same year, The Power of Habit came out at the same year that I was working on this series for the New York Times called The iEconomy about Apple that went on to win a Pulitzer Prize. And so this year, 2013, or 2012, these two things happen, and professionally, it's like this fantastic year for me. And I would go home at night and sit down. I have these two kids, and I'd sit down with my wife and my two kids for dinner, and I'd say to my wife, if this is what success feels like, then sign me the hell back up for failure, because this is the worst lifestyle I've ever had in my entire life. Because I would get home and I would have 100 emails to return every single night. And I'd go into work and it just felt so stressful all the time, and there was all these things happening. And this was very frustrating to me that I had worked so hard and so long and that it felt completely unrewarding. And I actually have this test to figure out if you feel the same way, which is this morning you woke up in a hotel room, but I want you to think back to 2 days ago. Think back to last Saturday. How many of you, within 5 minutes of waking up, looked at your smartphone or checked your email or something else? Go ahead and raise your hand if you looked at a device. Now, how many of you, within the first 5 minutes of waking up, rolled over and kissed the other person who was in bed with you, who assumably was your spouse, but depending on what was going on, might have been someone else? Many fewer hands went up. So if you have a more intimate relationship with your smartphone than you do with your spouse on a Saturday morning, that is a sign that something is wrong, right? That something has gone awry in our work-life balance. And so I got really interested in this, and I started doing some research trying to figure out, why is this true? And I started looking into who were the most productive folks. And I had this thesis going in, which is that there's so much information going on right now in our lives that the most productive people, the people who are able to be most effective and happiest, they're the ones who build these walls around themselves to sort of blank everything out. And then I started actually doing the research, and what I found was that there was a lot of research out there about why some people are more productive and successful and happier than others. And what it says is not that the most successful people work harder. It's that they somehow train themselves to think differently. And they think differently in two particular ways. First of all, they recognize that our brains evolved in a different time. A millennia ago, if you could multitask, if you could plant crops and look for predators at the same time, you killed it compared to the guy next to you who could only look for predators or only plant crops. But we all know now that these brains that evolved to multitask, that's completely overwhelming. We can lose our ability to remain focused very easily. You could spend your entire day replying to emails and be busy 24 hours a day and get nothing important done. And so people who are most productive, what the research tells us, is that they're people who tend to build habits that force themselves to think more deeply. And if you build habits to force yourself to think more deeply, because thinking has always been kind of the killer app, then you can expose yourselves to all kinds of information and learn how to screen out what's important and absorb what matters. So I got interested in this because there was a huge element of teams. And of course, one of the themes of this conference is how teams function. And I started looking at how teams help us build the right habits to be able to think more deeply. And out of that came an article that I wrote about Google, that Google studied teams. They tried to figure out how to build the perfect team. They found some very nice things, like you should encourage people to speak up more, you should ostentatiously listen, you should do things that, much like when Laszlo was on stage, sound like good things to do. And that these are all important. But that there was another element of how teams help us think that's a little bit more subtle. And to explain what it is, I want to tell you a story. And this is the story of a flight called Qantas Flight 32. In 2010, Qantas Flight 32 took off from the Singapore airport, headed to Sydney, Australia. Now, Qantas Flight 32 is this plane. It's an Airbus A380. It's one of the largest, most sophisticated aircraft ever made. It's one of those double-decker planes. If you've ever flown from one continent to another, you've probably flown on an Airbus A380. It's so advanced that it can essentially fly itself once it's put up into the air. And when it took off this morning in Singapore in 2010, textbook perfect takeoff. Up into the air, crystal clear blue day. The pilot reaches over, he hits the autopilot. About 20 minutes into the flight, all the pilots sitting in the cockpit, they hear this sound like thousands of marbles being thrown against the hull, the fuselage of the plane. Unbeknownst to them, what had just happened is that the most freak accident possible, a fire had broken out in one of the jet engines. And this fire had broken out at exactly the wrong place. It had broken out where one of the fan blades attached to the shaft. And because the shaft was spinning so hard, when this fire broke out, it got enough oxygen that it got hot enough that this fan blade detached from the shaft. And as it detached from the shaft, it shot through the wing. This is actually a photo that was later taken of the hole that erupted in the wing at 20,000 feet when this fan blade shot through the wing. I don't know what's more terrifying, this hole, which is actually big enough for two people standing side by side to pass through, or the fact that like some passenger's first instinct was like take out their phone and do like a selfie with a hole in the wing. But what's interesting is that this is not the bad thing that happened to Flight 32. The bad thing that happened, because an Airbus A380, it's so sophisticated, it can sustain an injury like this and continue flying without any problem for the next 8 hours. The bad thing that happened is that when that fan blade detached, it hit another fan blade. And as it hit that other fan blade, it caused the second fan blade to explode into thousands of pieces. And those thousands of pieces were like the shrapnel from a bomb going off inside the wing. And as they started moving through the wing, they started cutting through electrical lines and hydraulics lines. When they finally were able to recover the entire pieces of the engine, they said it looked like someone had taken a machine gun and sprayed the underside of the plane. Now what's interesting is that the pilots sitting in the cockpit, they're sitting there, this suddenly happens, this hole appears, and their dashboard lights up with alarms, all within seconds of each other. What they would eventually find out is that 11 of the 14 major systems that are needed to keep a plane aloft were all knocked out within 45 seconds. And what's interesting is that the guy who's flying this plane is this guy. He's a guy named Richard Duhigg. Richard Duhigg had been trained in how to fly airplanes by the Australian Air Force. And I don't know, is anyone here an Air Force vet? Okay, one person. So if you're taught how to fly by almost any nation's Air Force, you're taught in a certain way of thinking, which is known as situational awareness. You're probably aware of this phrase, situational awareness. It actually comes from aviation. And situational awareness is a way of teaching people to think so that they know how to react at moments of crisis like this. They know how to keep their focus on what's important when an emergency suddenly occurs and you only have seconds to respond. Situational awareness is basically the act of building mental models, or put differently, it's the act of telling ourselves stories about what we expect to happen as it happens. Because one of the things that we know from neurology is that our attention and our focus gets trained by the stories we tell ourselves. That if we're in the middle of a narrative, we kind of know almost automatically what matters and what doesn't. One of the big lessons about this in studies came from studies that were done of firefighters. And what they found is that the best firefighters who almost seem to have ESP when they walk into a burning building, that when researchers asked them, how did you know what was dangerous and what wasn't, that they all tended to answer by saying, well, I was telling myself this story. I'd walk into a building and I would think to myself, oh, that corner right over there, I expected there to be a lot of flames because there's a lot of flames in the corner, and there's a staircase over there, and I expect there to be a lot of flames on that staircase because there's an air gap under a staircase. And then I was telling myself this, and I walked into the room, and I looked over at the staircase, and there were fewer flames on the staircase than I expected, and something inside my brain just said, don't go near the staircase. There's something wrong with that staircase. Again and again and again, they would answer questions about how they knew something was going to go wrong by saying, I was telling myself a story, and that something in the world didn't line up with that story. Or in studies that have been done of executives, particularly executives who are very successful, who seem to be much more productive and to advance within their companies, particularly Fortune 500 companies, much faster than everyone else. This was this is a study that was done out of Stanford. What they found is that the people who were particularly successful, they tended to visualize their days with just half a degree more specificity than everyone else. So most of us, we say, oh, I have a meeting at 10 o'clock, and then I have to get ready for lunch, it's at 11:30. But the people who are very, very successful at work, they tend to say, oh, I have a meeting at 10 o'clock, and you know what? It's going to start with John bringing up that stupid idea that he always brings up, and then Kathy's going to disagree with him because they used to be sleeping together, now they hate each other, and so she's going to definitely disagree. And then at that moment, I'm going to jump in with my idea, and I'm going to win the meeting. They tend to think through and visualize their day just a little bit more than everyone else. And all of you do this, right? We all do this to varying degrees. Some of us do it unconsciously because we have an important meeting coming up or a tough phone call and we play it out in our minds. And others of us force ourselves to do it until it becomes a habit. And what's interesting about Richard de Crespigny, the guy who's flying this plane, Qantas Flight 32, he loves this stuff. The morning before he had gotten on Qantas Flight 32, he had gone through this routine that he always went through with all of his co-pilots, which is that in the shuttle from the hotel to the airport, he made them tell him stories about what they would do in case of an emergency. He would say things like, if engine 2 goes out, what are the first words out of your mouth? If engine 4 has a problem, where are your eyes going to go? What are you going to do with your hands? And if you listen to the tape of what happens inside that cockpit right after the hole appears in that wing, in what would later be declared the greatest mid-air mechanical disaster in modern aviation, if you listen to the tape of what's going on in the cockpit, it sounds like people are reading from a script. Everyone speaks in these short, clipped sentences. There's no element of panic in anyone's voice. It's as if they had practiced this, because in some senses they had. And in 99% of situations, that would have saved everyone on board. But in this case, there were so many problems with Qantas Flight 32 that there were literally not enough scripts on Earth to save the plane. As soon as they would deal with one problem, 10 more problems would emerge. And then they would deal with 3 of those problems, and the computer starts spitting out another 15 emergencies. Simply solving one emergency would actually create other emergencies, because suddenly there was room for the system to absorb all the cataclysmic damage that was affecting this plane. And so, at this moment, Richard de Crespigny, the captain of this flight, he does this incredibly interesting thing. He's in the cockpit. He's surrounded by his co-pilots. There's alarms going off. He's been trying to create a mental model, tell himself the story of this plane, to keep track of where the fuel is and where the damage is and whether the fire is going to spread from one wing to the other and what he ought to be doing. And he's looking at the computer that's giving him all these commands. And he realizes it's overwhelming. He can't build mental models robust enough to accommodate what's going on. And he feels himself getting drawn into what's known as a cognitive tunnel. Now, you've all experienced a cognitive tunnel, and this is a well-documented thing in neurology. When you're driving down the freeway and you're going the speed limit and you see a cop car out of the corner of your eye and you hit the brake without having to actually slow down, that's a cognitive tunnel. When you're at home and you're making dinner and you're talking to your kids and you're trying to pour some wine and suddenly you get a text from your boss and you pick it up and you hastily reply and hit send, and as soon as you hit send, think to yourself, I really wish I'd waited 10 more minutes before hitting send and rereading that. That's a cognitive tunnel. A cognitive tunnel is our brain's natural reaction to too much stimulus. What we tend to do is we tend to focus on the most obvious stimuli that's right in front of our eyes, because our brain doesn't have a story to guide it. It's not possible to come up with a story fast enough. And so as a result, whatever seems most obvious is what we tend to latch onto. And as Richard de Crespigny is sitting in that cockpit, he feels himself getting drawn into this cognitive tunnel. He's been trained to recognize a cognitive tunnel. And so what he does is, in the middle of this emergency, he takes his hands off of the controls, he puts them in his lap, and he closes his eyes. And he says to himself, I have been trying to build a mental model, tell myself a story about this flight, and it's just not working. Because I've been trying to envision this big, complicated airplane, an Airbus A380, and there's too much going on that's wrong for me to really know what to pay attention to. And he decides in that split second, and only about 7 minutes have passed since this emergency started, he decides in that split second to come up with an entirely new story. He decides instead that he's going to start pretending and imagining that he is flying a Cessna. Now, has anyone in this room ever flown in a Cessna before? Okay, a number of you have. So you know that if I was to put an Airbus A380 and a Cessna next to each other, it would not look like this. It would look like this, right? A Cessna is like a toy compared to an Airbus A380. They have almost nothing in common, except that a Cessna has the three things that any airplane needs in order to fly. It has a navigation system, it has the ability to go up and down in the air, and it has landing gear. And so de Crespigny, sitting in that seat, says to himself, I learned to fly on a Cessna. I know a Cessna like the back of my hand. I'm feeling totally overwhelmed. I'm literally going to pretend like I am flying a Cessna. So by now they've managed to turn the flight around, and they're headed back to the Singapore airport. And as they start approaching the runway in Singapore, a couple of things happen. Air traffic control contacts them and they say, according to our computers, you need a runway that is 2,200 meters long in order to land this plane because you're going so fast, and the longest runway that we have is only 2,000 meters. And then they also say, we think you should abort because our computer shows that you're going to crash. And de Crespigny says, I can't really abort, there's nowhere else to go, stop talking to me. As they're approaching the runway, they're getting closer and closer and closer, and this alarm goes off inside the cockpit, and you can hear this on the cockpit recordings. That's called a squealer. Now, probably no one in this room has ever heard a squealer before. It's an alarm. Oh, you've heard it? You are, thank goodness you're here. And a squealer is an alarm that has been designed to be so loud and annoying that you can't ignore it. It can revive pilots who are near unconsciousness. And as they're approaching the runway, because they're going so fast, the onboard computer detects that a crash is imminent, and the squealer goes off. And de Crespigny turns to his co-pilots, and he says, look, I understand the squealer is going off, and it's an alarm that's designed that we can't ignore it. But in my head, I'm flying a Cessna. And by the way, they don't even put a squealer on a Cessna. So just ignore the squealer. So at which point, I talked to some of the co-pilots. They all thought he was totally crazy. They get closer and closer. They actually manage to touch down. The wheels absorb the speed and absorb the heft. They're speeding down the runway. And at the Singapore airport, all the runways are surrounded by these sand dunes and then the ocean. And as they're moving down the runway, if they hit those sand dunes with too much speed, the plane will literally flip over and kill everyone on board. And so as they're going down the runway, de Crespigny thinks to himself, okay, now I need to try and brake, but he doesn't know if the brakes work. He doesn't know if the brake lines have been cut by all the damage in the wing. And if he was flying a Cessna, this is what he would do. He would press the brake pedal once and hold it down and then pray. And so that's literally what he does in this plane, is he presses the brake pedal down once, he holds it like this, and he starts muttering under his breath a prayer that the brakes will finally hold up. And the brakes actually hold up. The plane starts getting slower and slower and slower, but they're still speeding down this runway. And according to the computers, they don't have enough room to actually stop the plane. And he could see the sand dunes at the end of the runway, and as they're getting closer and closer and closer, he can hear the metal groaning around him as it's trying to cascade all of this speed, and they get closer to the end, and they finally stop with 100 meters to spare. 48 minutes later, all 469 passengers on board the plane walk off without one injury. They have tried to recreate this landing over 150 times in simulators. They've had everyone try and land it, including like Sully. And I think they actually got Tom Hanks to do it too. No other person has ever managed to land that plane in the simulator without killing everyone. And what's interesting is that if you go and you ask de Crespigny why he was able to do this, he will tell you that he has no idea. Right? He has no idea why this worked. Maybe he got completely lucky. Maybe thinking about this plane as a Cessna was exactly the wrong thing to do. But what he'll tell you is that the only real mistake he could have made at that point is to stop making decisions. And that, as we all know, when you are in a moment of crisis, the first thing you do is you stop making decisions. You hit the brake pedal. You type the response to your boss. You react instead of thinking. And that by forcing himself to simply change his mental model to say this is a Cessna instead of an Airbus A380, if nothing else, it gave him enough space to simply make choices. And so the question then becomes, why was he able to do that? Why was de Crespigny able to pivot at exactly the right moment? And as researchers have looked at this, what they found is the answer is this. They have found that if you talk to Richard de Crespigny, and I've talked to him like half a dozen times at this point, you will discover within about 5 minutes of talking to him that Richard de Crespigny is one of the greatest assholes on the face of the planet. He is a man who will literally pick a fight with you over anything. The first time I talked to him, he slammed the phone down on me because he thought that I was asking him rude questions. We were like in this huge argument. I once got into a 20-minute conversation with him, argument, about the proper ingredients for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which you would not think there's that many options, and he is Australian. But the point being, he is a man who picks fights with everyone. He loves to argue. It's like his entire way of being. In fact, just that morning when he had been in that shuttle from the hotel to the airport, and he would ask his colleagues, what are you going to do with your hands if there's a problem or if there's an emergency? And they would say what they were going to do. He would argue with all of them about what their responses are. Put differently, Richard de Crespigny has a habit that forces him to think. And that habit is he's a super argumentative guy. Now, this does not mean that you need to be argumentative, right? This doesn't mean that you should find people who are assholes and hire them. But there is this important lesson, I think, embedded in this, that we know about productive people and how they work in companies and teams, which is that the most productive people, they tend to be people who understand that focus comes through telling ourselves stories, but that is not enough on its own. That we don't generate productivity simply by building mental models within our own minds, that rather those mental models become genuinely productive, that they push us to be better when they happen in the context of teams who force us to challenge the assumptions that we've made. And I'm guessing that everyone in this room, and I think this aligns with what we've been talking about on the stage today, I'm guessing that everyone in this room, that you have someone on your team who challenges you all the time, right? And it's probably someone that you would not like to have a beer with after work. But it is someone who you want in every single meeting, because you know that they're going to challenge you, that they're going to make you question your underlying biases, that they're going to be transparently honest with you. And when we talk about teams and when we hear Laszlo talk about teams, we tend to think of them as happy places. I think you've heard a lot on the stage today that we want to find people who are happy. We want to let them do their best work because they're happiest doing their best work. And we all know that is important. We all know how corrosive it can be to hire an asshole. But there are other ways of challenging ourselves and other people. And in this conversation about happiness and about productivity, we tend to forget that the things that are actually most productive don't necessarily feel productive at the moment. That having someone who disagrees with you, who challenges you, having someone who is radically transparent and tells you that your newspaper is totally sensationalized, that isn't necessarily fun at the moment, but that is actually what makes us think. And the more that we make that into a habit, the more that we surround ourselves with people who force us to think, the more we end up, according to the studies, becoming more productive. So hopefully that's helpful. I hope you're all assholes to each other.